It was a day that started like any other, but what happened next would shake the entire town to its core. In a quiet neighborhood, a dog named Max was running scared, his eyes wide with fear, his body trembling with desperation. Max wasn't just any dog, he was a stray, a survivor who had lived through pain and abandonment for years. But today was different. Today he was cornered by the one thing he feared most, the law. The cops, armed with a rifle, had their sights set on him. They had been called to handle what they thought was a dangerous animal, a threat to the community. But as they closed in on Max, something incredible happened, something no one expected. Just as the officers prepared to make a heartbreaking decision, a voice interrupted. It wasn't a shout, but a calm, firm voice that demanded justice. The judge, yes, the judge, who had been overseeing the case from behind the scenes, took matters into his own hands. What he did in that courtroom not only shocked the town, but also gave Max the second chance that so desperately needed. The town was divided, but one thing was clear. Max's fate was no longer in the hands of fear, but in the hands of compassion. What followed next would leave everyone questioning the true meaning of justice and what it really takes to save a life. Stay with us as we unfold the dramatic, heart-wrenching story of a dog's survival against all odds and the judge who changed everything. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the sleepy neighborhood. The kind of quiet evening where the only sounds you hear are the chirping of birds, the soft rustle of trees, and the distant hum of a lawnmower cutting grass. But amidst this calm, a brown and white dog was darting nervously between parked cars, his tail tucked tightly between his legs. Max, a stray dog, was clearly on edge, moving with an urgency that betrayed his fear. His matted fur caught the late afternoon sun, and his eyes, wide, frantic, scanned the surroundings as if he were looking for a way out. He wasn't like the dogs you'd see playing fetch in a park or lying peacefully at the feet of their owners. Max was a survivor, but survival wasn't easy. His body showed the marks of a hard life. He had been on the streets for months, maybe even years. His ribs stuck out, his fur was tangled with dirt and grime, and his eyes, always so full of fear, never seemed to find peace. They told a story of abandonment, of cruelty, of being left to fend for himself in a world that didn't care. He had learned to trust no one, to rely only on his own instincts. And those instincts told him one thing: run. The air felt heavy as Max darted from car to car, moving like a shadow in the fading light. His paws, sore from days of walking on the harsh pavement, scraped against the concrete. But it didn't matter. He had to keep moving. He could hear the distant sounds of footsteps, the faint echo of voices, and that gut-wrenching sound that he had come to dread, sirens. They were getting closer. Max froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The sirens were drawing nearer, and soon he could hear the telltale screech of police cars pulling up to the street. The familiar sense of dread settled into his stomach. The officers climbed out of their vehicles, their boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. They were here for him. Max's ears twitched, and his muscles tensed. He wanted to run, to disappear, but he was trapped in this quiet neighborhood with no way to escape. He couldn't go left, not with the officers moving that way. He couldn't go right. That path was blocked by the same officers who were already closing in. The dog's fate seemed to hang in the balance, and as the officers began to move closer, Max growled from a distance. But it wasn't an aggressive growl. It was a fearful growl, a warning to let them know that he wasn't about to go down without a fight. Max didn't understand what was happening. All he knew was that these people, these officers, were not his friends. They were just another set of hands that had been sent to harm him. Every human he'd encountered before had either ignored him or hurt him, and the deep scars on his soul told him to trust no one. The officers called out to him, their voices stern and commanding. "Come here, boy," one of them shouted, but Max was too terrified to move closer. His instincts screamed at him to stay away, to keep his distance from these strangers. His heart raced, his body trembling as they moved forward, step by step. Max backed up, inching slowly toward the narrow space between two parked cars. He didn't have many options, but he had to try something. The officers exchanged nervous glances as they realized the dog wasn't backing down. This wasn't going to be easy. They weren't trained to handle this. Not a dog like Max, a dog that had been through who knows what. and the fear in his eyes only made them more uncertain. One of the officers, a tall man with a deep voice, raised his radio to call for backup. "We've got an aggressive dog here, possibly a stray. Keep your distance. I'll try to contain it." He paused, glancing over at Max, who was now crouched low to the ground, his ears pinned back, growling with increasing intensity. "Get the tranquilizer gun," the officer added, but it was too late. Max wasn't going to wait for the tranquilizer to come. He was ready to bolt. The other officers moved in slowly, trying to surround him, but Max wasn't just any dog. He had lived through things no dog should ever have to endure. And though the officers saw him as a danger to the community, Max only saw them as another threat. The fear coursing through his veins was palpable. His body was shaking, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he watched the officers close in on him. Every movement they made felt like a step closer to the inevitable. The standoff was building. Max didn't know it, but a decision was already being made. The officers, following protocol, were thinking of what came next. They were trained to deal with situations like this, when a dog was seen as aggressive, when it posed a danger to the people around it. And in those moments, when fear and aggression collide, the outcome was often the same. Max could feel the weight of it in the air, the impending doom that was closing in on him. His muscles tensed, and he let out a low whimper. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the fear that had been with him for so long. And just as the officers were preparing to take their next step, the one that would seal Max's fate, the world seemed to stop. A voice cut through the tension like a knife. It wasn't the voice of one of the officers, but a new, calm voice. It was clear, firm, and unyielding. "Stop," the voice commanded. The officers froze, their hands hovering over their weapons. Max's ears perked up at the sound. His eyes flickered toward the direction of the voice. Standing there, just a few feet away, was someone none of them expected to see: Judge Samuel Henderson. Judge Henderson wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in his chambers, working on the cases before him, but he had heard about the dog in the neighborhood, and he decided to take action. The judge had long been known for his compassion, for his belief in second chances, and for his insistence that the law was not always the answer. He wasn't about to let this dog die today. The officers turned to face the judge, their confusion clear. "Your Honor, this dog is a threat." "We have to do something?" one of them said, his voice shaky. Judge Henderson's gaze never wavered. "No," he said simply, walking forward with purpose. "This dog is not a threat. He's afraid." Max's eyes flickered with a glimmer of hope. The judge wasn't like the others. The way he spoke, the way he looked at him, was different. It was the first time that day that Max didn't feel entirely alone. It was the first time that day someone had seen him for what he truly was: not a danger, but a dog lost in fear, just trying to survive. As the tension hung in the air, Judge Henderson took a few more steps toward Max, ignoring the officers who were still frozen in place. He knelt down to Max's level, his voice soft, almost like a whisper. "You're safe now," he murmured, just loud enough for Max to hear. And for the first time, Max felt a flicker of trust. But as the officers watched in stunned silence, something unexpected happened. Max took a step forward, then another, his body still trembling but no longer as stiff with fear. He was listening, he was trusting. The officers, still unsure of what was happening, exchanged glances. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. What would happen next? Would Max be given the second chance he deserved? Or would fear once again decide his fate? The suspense in the air was thick, and the sound of Max's soft whimpering was the only thing that broke the silence. Max's frantic barks echoed down the quiet street, each one a desperate cry for help. The sound of his fear filled the air as he darted between the parked cars, his body trembling with anxiety. The officers were closing in, their footsteps heavy against the pavement. And with each step they took, Max grew more desperate. He didn't understand what was happening, only that the sirens, the people in uniform, and the voices shouting at him felt like threats. To Max, these weren't just strangers. They were figures that represented every painful memory of abandonment, every person who had hurt him or ignored him. His heart pounded as his body instinctively moved faster, looking for a way out. The officers were now close enough to see the dog clearly. Max is brown, and white coat stood out in the fading light of the evening. But it wasn't his appearance that caught their attention. It was his behavior. His defensive stance, his growls, his refusal to back down. They saw a dog they believed to be aggressive, a danger to the neighborhood, and it made them take swift action. They had a job to do, and Max was the threat they had to neutralize. One officer, a tall man with a grim face, quickly radioed for backup, his voice sharp with urgency. "We've got a dangerous dog here. Prepare to tranquilize him." His words were professional, but there was a hint of something darker in his tone. Max's growls grew louder, sharper. He wasn't just scared now. He was terrified, and that fear had manifested into something that felt like raw, uncontrollable aggression. "Get the tranquilizer gun." The officer called again, his eyes never leaving Max. But just as the officer raised his rifle, poised to make the next move, a strange calm settled over the scene. It was an eerie silence, like the world itself had stopped for just a moment. Max stood frozen, his body rigid, his tail tucked, staring at the officer with wide, terrified eyes. The tension hung thick in the air, but then, breaking through it like a light piercing the darkness, came a voice. "Stop." The command wasn't shouted, but it was firm and unmistakable. It wasn't the voice of an officer or anyone Max had seen before. It was the voice of someone different, someone with authority, but more importantly, someone with compassion. The officers who had been ready to carry out their task turned, confused, to see who had spoken. And there, walking toward them, was none other than Judge Samuel Henderson. Judge Henderson was a familiar face in the town. He wasn't just a judge, he was a figure of authority and, more importantly, a symbol of fairness. He had spent his career presiding over cases where mercy and justice collided, and his reputation was built on the belief that even the most difficult situations deserved a chance at redemption. He wasn't just known for his rulings, he was known for his heart, a heart that had seen the worst of humanity, but still believed in the possibility of change. "Your Honor, this is a dangerous animal," one officer said, his voice filled with confusion and a trace of frustration. He was still holding his rifle, the barrel pointed in Max's direction. "We were ordered to handle the situation. It's not safe to let him go." Judge Henderson didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood there, looking at Max with a steady gaze, before he looked back at the officers. "This dog isn't dangerous. He's scared. You're not dealing with an aggressor. You're dealing with a frightened animal. And you're about to make a decision that could cost him his life." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them moved. They had been trained to handle situations like this, to neutralize threats. But this wasn't just another routine call. This was a living being, and the judge wasn't about to let them treat Max like an object to be discarded. The quiet that followed felt like an eternity. The officers, who had been ready to act, now seemed uncertain. Max, still crouched low to the ground, wasn't sure what to make of the change. He had always been on the run, always been the one chased, always been the one to fear the hands that reached for him. But now, for the first time that day, there was someone standing between him and the officers. Someone who wasn't holding a weapon, someone who wasn't trying to force him into submission. Max's eyes, wide and fearful, flickered between the judge and the officers. He could feel the shift in the air, the heaviness of the moment, the chance that this could be different. This time, there might be someone on his side, but was it too late? Judge Henderson moved forward, taking slow, deliberate steps. The officers made no attempt to stop him. The judge's calm demeanor seemed to cut through the tension, his every movement radiating authority, but also understanding. He didn't look at Max as a danger. He saw a creature in distress, a soul that needed compassion, not punishment. The judge knelt down to Max's level, his eyes softening as he spoke. "You're safe now," he whispered, just loud enough for Max to hear. "I won't let them hurt you." For a moment, nothing happened. Max didn't move. His body was still rigid, his fear still overwhelming, but the sound of the judge's voice, calm and kind, seemed to break through the walls Max had built around himself. His ears twitched. He didn't move forward, but he didn't back away either. He was listening. The officers stood behind the judge, unsure of what to do next. Some shifted nervously from foot to foot, their hands still hovering near their holsters. They weren't trained for situations like this. where emotion, compassion, and instinct took precedence over protocol. But the judge wasn't concerned with what the officers had been trained to do. He wasn't concerned with the rules that everyone else followed. He was concerned with one thing: saving Max's life. "You're not going to shoot him," the judge said firmly, looking back at the officers. "He deserves a chance. No more fear. No more pain. I'm giving him a chance to live." The officers remained silent, still unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the air was thick, but something had changed. The quiet, calm words of the judge had shattered the tension that had held them all in place. The gun was no longer raised, and the standoff had come to a sudden halt. Max stood still, his body trembling, his eyes never leaving the judge. There was still fear in those eyes, fear that would take time to heal, fear that was rooted deep in his past. But for the first time in a long time, Max wasn't sure if he was alone anymore. As the judge stood up, he turned to the officers. "I'm taking responsibility for this dog," he said. "Get him to a safe place, and we'll figure out what happens next." He didn't give them a chance to protest. The judge's decision was final. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, but they didn't argue. They simply nodded, and with slow, measured steps, they moved toward Max. The tension hadn't fully dissipated, but there was something different in the air now, something more hopeful. Max stood there, his tail still tucked, but his body no longer as tense as before. He didn't move toward the officers, but he didn't run either. For the first time in his life, he was given something he had never known: a choice, a chance. The officers carefully approached, their hands gentle as they reached out to him. Max didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He was still scared, but there was no longer the overwhelming terror that had gripped him moments ago. Max had been given a chance to survive, to heal, to live. But what would happen next? Would he be able to trust again? Would the community accept him, or would fear and misunderstanding win out in the end? The judge turned back to look at Max one final time, his face soft with a mixture of hope and concern. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Max's journey had only just begun. As the officers led him toward the shelter, the weight of the moment hung in the air. For the first time, Max had been given more than just a second chance. He had been given hope, but the story was far from over. Would the town accept him? Would they let him heal, or would the scars of his past always haunt him? Only time would tell. The courtroom was packed, the air felt thick with tension, and it wasn't just the anticipation of the trial. It was the weight of Max's fate that hung over every person present. The cold, gray walls of the courthouse seemed to echo the anxiety in the room. People from all over the town had gathered, some with a quiet hope in their hearts, others with their arms crossed, unsure of what the outcome would be. On the surface, this was just another case, but beneath it all, it was much more than that. This was a battle for a life, a battle for Max's life. Max, the brown and white stray who had been at the center of so much chaos, now sat quietly in the corner of the courtroom, his eyes downcast. He wasn't the fierce, growling animal the officers had first encountered in the street. He wasn't the terrified creature who had feared the world around him. No, this was the aftermath of everything he'd been through. A broken spirit, fragile and unsure. His fur had been cleaned up, his wounds tended to, but the scars on his soul were still visible. He had been the dog who was feared, labeled as dangerous, but Max was no longer just a stray in the street. He was a symbol of a much bigger issue. The prosecution stood, presenting their case. The prosecutor's voice was cold, calculating, as he painted Max as a dangerous animal that had to be dealt with. "This dog," he said, his finger pointing toward Max, "was a clear threat to the safety of our community. He was aggressive, unpredictable, and violent. The officers did what they had to do. They acted in self-defense and in the interest of public safety." He paced slowly, letting his words sink into the minds of the jurors, the town, and even the judge. "This animal's behavior is not only dangerous to our streets but to our children. There is no place for a dog like this here." The words hit hard. The room was still, almost silent. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Max, sitting quietly in his corner, seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusation. Was this how the town saw him? As just another menace to be feared, just another dangerous dog that needed to be removed. It felt like the world had closed in on him again, just as it had that day in the street when the officers had cornered him. He had been labeled, and now it seemed that label was being cemented in this courtroom. But then, the voice of Judge Samuel Henderson cut through the tension. He wasn't just a figure in a black robe presiding over a case. He was the one who had already made up his mind, the same man who had stood between Max and the officers in the street, the same man who had chosen to give Max a chance. He stood up, his calm demeanor never wavering. He was the one who had taken responsibility for Max's fate, but now, here in the courtroom, he had to fight for it. "Objection," the judge said, his voice firm, yet full of conviction. "Max is not an animal born of malice, nor is he the threat you claim he is. He is a dog who has lived in fear for too long, and his actions that day were driven by that fear, not an inherent desire to harm." The judge paused, looking directly at the prosecutor, then slowly shifting his gaze toward the jury. "I know what the evidence seems to suggest, but I ask you all to think about this. What is the true nature of fear, and how often have we seen that which we fear is not truly what we think it is?" The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge's words sank in. The prosecution had painted a picture of a violent dog, one that needed to be put down, one that couldn't be trusted. But Judge Henderson was standing firm, offering a different perspective. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "This dog has not acted out of aggression, he has acted out of survival. For every person who has called him a threat, there have been countless others who have turned their backs on him, abandoned him, and hurt him." The judge's eyes softened as he turned to Max, still sitting quietly, his eyes trained on the floor. "This is not a dog who was born evil. This is a dog who was shaped by the cruelty of others." The courtroom was silent for a moment, and Max, though he didn't fully understand the words, felt something shift. It was as if the world was finally starting to see him for who he truly was, not just a stray dog, not just a threat, but a survivor. And for the first time, Max's heart started to calm just a little. The defense attorney stood next, his voice steady and calm as he spoke in Max's defense. "Your Honor," he began, "Max is not the animal you've been led to believe he is. He is a victim of abuse, neglect, and abandonment. He has spent the better part of his life trying to survive in a world that showed him nothing but cruelty. And the actions we saw in the street that day, those actions were not the result of malice, but of the deep fear that had been instilled in him over the years." The defense continued to argue that Max's behavior was not indicative of a dangerous dog, but of a traumatized one. "We've seen this pattern in animals before," the defense attorney said. "When a dog is abused, when they're left to fend for themselves in a hostile world, they learn to be defensive, they learn to protect themselves." Max's actions were a direct result of his past, not a reflection of his true nature. He is not a threat, he is a dog in need of compassion, not punishment. The jury and the rest of the town was listening now, truly listening. The arguments presented by both sides had been emotional, but they had also been compelling. The air was thick with the weight of Max's fate, and for the first time, people were beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about a dog being aggressive. It was about what had led to that aggression. It was about the fear, the pain, and the heartache that had shaped Max into what he was now. Judge Henderson's eyes scanned the courtroom, and he took a deep breath before speaking again. "This is not just a decision about a dog," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying sense of urgency. "This is a decision about how we treat those who are vulnerable, those who have no voice of their own. Max may be a dog, but he is a living being, and we have a responsibility to show him the same kindness and mercy that we would show anyone else." The judge's words seemed to hang in the air, almost palpable. The room was still and all eyes were on him. Max was more than just a dog. He was a symbol of something much bigger. A symbol of compassion in a world that often didn't show mercy. The town was divided. Some people believed Max should be put down, seen as too dangerous to be allowed to roam free. Others, like the judge, believed that Max deserved a chance to heal, to live, to find peace. The jury's decision was coming. But it wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about what kind of community they wanted to be. Did they want to be the kind of place that discarded those who were broken, or the kind that gave them a second chance. The tension was unbearable, and as the courtroom waited for the judge to make his final ruling, it was clear this case was about more than just Max. It was about the very heart of the town and the decision that would shape its future. The judge stood up, his robes sweeping behind him as he walked to the bench. He paused for a moment, looking down at Max, who was sitting quietly in the corner. The dog's eyes were full of uncertainty, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of hope, a flicker of trust. Max wasn't just waiting for a decision, he was waiting for his future. And so was the town. What would the judge decide? Would he choose mercy, or would he give in to the pressure of the prosecution's argument? The clock ticked on, and the room waited with bated breath. The courtroom was on the edge of a precipice, and the judge's next words would decide everything. The courtroom was filled with anticipation, every eye on the judge as he prepared to hear the final arguments. Max, the dog at the center of it all, sat quietly in the corner of the room. His fur, now clean and brushed, looked soft under the bright fluorescent lights. But there was nothing soft about the tension in the air. The prosecution had presented their case, painting Max as a dangerous animal, a threat to the safety of the community. The defense had argued that Max was simply a victim of his circumstances, a dog who'd been shaped by years of abuse and neglect. It seemed like the town's fate was hanging in the balance, and the whole courtroom was holding its breath. Max's journey, from the fear-stricken animal in the streets to the courtroom floor, had already been filled with twists and turns. But the biggest revelation was still to come. Just as the trial reached its peak, a surprising twist emerged. The prosecution, confident that they had won the case, didn't expect what was about to happen next. The courtroom doors opened quietly, and in stepped a woman who had not been seen before. She wasn't a lawyer, and she wasn't part of the team defending Max. She was an animal rescue worker, someone who had spent years working with abused animals. Her name was Lisa, and she had come to reveal a truth that would change everything. Lisa stood at the witness stand, her hands shaking just slightly as she looked out at the room. The eyes of the courtroom were all on her, but Lisa wasn't looking at the jury or the judge. She was looking at Max, who sat in the corner, his ears perked up as he listened to the voice that had come to speak for him. For a moment, the silence was so thick you could almost hear the sound of a pin dropping. Lisa took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've known Max for a long time," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I've worked with hundreds of dogs in my career, but Max's story is one that has stuck with me. One that I've carried with me ever since the day I first met him." A murmur passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, seemed unsettled. What was this new information? How could this change the direction of the trial? Lisa continued, her eyes still locked on Max. Max wasn't always the dog you see here today. He wasn't always the scared, defensive dog that you've seen in the videos or in the police reports. She paused, letting the words sink in. Max was once a beloved family pet. The room fell silent again. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Max, a family pet. The dog who had been labeled dangerous, a threat to the community, had once been someone's companion. It didn't make sense. The prosecution had made it clear that Max was a threat, a creature to be feared. But now everything was changing. Lisa took another step forward, her voice growing more tender as she spoke. Max's life wasn't always this way. He had a home, he had a family who loved him. He was well cared for, well fed. But then his owner passed away. And after that, everything changed for Max. He was left behind, abandoned. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Max's history, the truth of his life, had been hidden for so long. The prosecutor's argument that Max was dangerous by nature was beginning to crumble. This wasn't just a case of an aggressive dog. This was a story of loss, of heartbreak, of a creature who had been left alone in a world that had no place for him. Lisa's voice broke slightly as she continued. "I first met Max when he was wandering the streets, just trying to survive. He was terrified. His eyes were wide with fear. And every time someone came near him, he would run. But it wasn't because he was vicious. It was because he had learned to trust no one. He had been abandoned, left behind to fend for himself. The pain of losing his family, the person he had loved and trusted, left him broken. The courtroom was still. No one moved. Lisa's words were powerful, her connection to Max clear. She wasn't just recounting the story of a dog, she was telling the story of survival, of resilience, and of the pain that so many animals endure when they are abandoned by the people they trust. The prosecutor stood, trying to regain control of the room. "Objection," he said, his voice tight. "This is irrelevant. This doesn't change the fact that this dog is a danger to the public. We can't excuse his behavior just because of his past." But Lisa wasn't finished. "I understand that you see Max as a threat," she said, her voice still calm but full of conviction. "But what you don't understand is that Max didn't choose to be this way. He didn't wake up one day and decide to be aggressive. He didn't choose to be abandoned. He didn't choose to live in fear. What you see now is a result of a lifetime of hurt. What you see now is the dog who has been running from the world, just trying to survive." Lisa's words hit like a tidal wave, crashing over everything the prosecution had said. The truth of Max's life, his painful journey, was being laid bare. No longer could they pretend he was just another dangerous animal. Max wasn't born a threat. Max was a victim of circumstance, and the courtroom was beginning to realize it. The judge, who had remained silent through the exchange, finally spoke. "What you're telling us is that Max was once a pet, a beloved member of a family," he said, his voice steady but full of weight. "And what happened to him after that?" He turned his gaze to Lisa, waiting for her to continue. Lisa nodded, her eyes softening as she spoke. "After Max's owner died, there was no one to care for him, no one to look after him. He was left alone, wandering the streets. That's when I found him. He was malnourished, scared, and alone. He wasn't dangerous, Your Honor. He was just a lost dog, searching for the love and safety he once knew. He didn't know where to turn, and he didn't trust anyone. He had been let down by the one person he had relied on his entire life." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room felt the weight of her words. Max's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about searching for the one thing he had lost, the love and safety of a home. And now, in this courtroom, the truth of his story had finally been revealed. The prosecutor, unable to hide his frustration, turned to the judge. "But this dog, Your Honor, he's a danger. He attacked officers. He growled at people. What do we do with a dog like that?" The judge looked over at Max, his gaze lingering for a moment. "What do we do with a dog who has known nothing but pain and abandonment? What do we do with a dog who has been forced to fend for himself, to trust no one, to live in constant fear? Do we condemn him for his survival instincts? Or do we look at him for what he is, a living being who has suffered and who deserves a chance at healing?" The tension in the room was palpable, and the question lingered in the air. The courtroom, which had been divided just moments before, was now united in its understanding of Max's story. It wasn't about a dog who had chosen to be violent. It was about a dog who had been forced to become that way. Max's fate was hanging in the balance, but the courtroom had shifted. The defense was no longer just about arguing against Max's aggression. It was about arguing for his right to heal, to find peace, to trust again. As the judge prepared to give his ruling, Max sat in his corner, his body spuddy, filled with something that had been missing for so long. Hope. Would he get the chance to heal, to trust again, or would the world turn its back on him once more? The courtroom waited with bated breath, and as the judge raised his gavel, the room held its collective breath, knowing that this decision would forever change the way they viewed Max, and the way they viewed every animal who had ever suffered in silence. Would the judge grant him the chance to start over? Or was this just another chapter to a sad, tragic tale? The decision was about to be made, and Max's future, his very life, was on the line. As the judge raised his gavel, the courtroom held its breath. Max sat in his corner, his once fearful eyes now showing a glimmer of hope. The decision was coming, and it was more than just about a dog. It was about compassion, mercy, and second chances. Judge Henderson, with a steady hand, looked at Max one last time before speaking. "Max," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you are not just an animal to be feared. You are a creature who has suffered, who has been abandoned, and who has survived despite everything that has happened to you. Today, I choose compassion. I choose mercy. I choose to give you the chance that you deserve." The weight of his words echoed through the room. Max's journey, once marked by fear and survival, was about to take a new direction. The judge's decision was final, and Max would have the chance to heal, to trust again, and to find a new home. One filled with love and care. As the courtroom erupted into whispers, Max stood tall, no longer a symbol of fear, but a symbol of hope. The town had finally seen him for who he truly was. Not a threat, but a survivor. And for the first time in his life, Max was given the chance to live,